brought to you by our online learning platform, the Religion Department. Join our upcoming seminar, Learning Coptic through the Gospel of Thomas, to learn the final phase of the ancient Egyptian language. Few prophets in Islam are as mysterious as Idris. He's commonly identified as the biblical prophet Enoch. Like Enoch, Idris is considered an esoteric or mysterious figure, strongly associated with secret wisdom and the mysteries of creation. And yet, most of what we know about Idris does not actually come from the Quran. Again, like Enoch, the details come later, in layers of commentary, legend, and interpretation that grew up around him. But notice they have noticeably different names, and the Quran itself never comes right out and says that Idris and Enoch are one and the same. So what exactly is Idris' relationship to Enoch? Are they really the same figure? And if they are, what sets the Islamic version of Enoch apart from his portrayals in Jewish and Christian traditions? Just a quick note up front, the question of who exactly Idris is has never been fully settled, whether we're talking about early medieval or modern Muslim thought. In this video, we'll only scratch the surface, but I'm aiming to give you a solid introduction to the figure. Let's start with the obvious place, the Quran, where he shows up only twice. In Surah 19, Idris is described as follows. Mentioned too in the scripture the story of Idris. He was a man of truth, a prophet. We raised him to a high position. He shows up here in a section explaining the importance of other prophets. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Ishmael, Moses, all of whom are known from Jewish and Christian traditions. Here, God is describing the virtues of each prophet and the grace he gave to each one of them. Idris is called truthful, or Siddiq in Arabic, a word that can also carry the connotation of being totally faithful to God, in a sense of fully accepting the truth of God's power and his will in the world. Notably, in this passage, only Idris and Abraham are given that title. Okay, but this still doesn't answer our question, who is he? Well, Surah 21 gives us another small clue. It's only 2 verses, but once again he's singled out as someone especially favored by God. And remember Ishmael, Idris, and Dul-Kifl. They were all steadfast. We admitted them to our mercy. They were truly righteous. Like in Surah 19, Idris is not described on his own, but in relation to other prophets. Ishmael is a familiar name, but the one that follows, Dul-Kifl, is not. His name means possessor of the portion, and scholars have suggested that he could be Ezekiel, Joshua, Obadiah, Isaiah, or even the Buddha. Quite a mix of candidates. Idris is already a mysterious figure, and here he's listed next to yet another prophet whose identity is unclear. So we still haven't made much progress in figuring out his identity. Still, what stands out here is Idris is described as steadfast, righteous, and blessed with God's mercy. Another puzzle is his name, which does not have a clear Arabic origin. Like the name Iblis, Islam's primary name for Satan, Idris follows what's called the Ifil pattern, an Arabic word formation that often appears in words borrowed from other languages. This might suggest that the name Idris has a foreign origin. The name might come from the Arabic root letters Dal, Ra, Sin, akin to the Hebrew letters Dalet, Resh, Shin, which generally relate to the concepts of studying or learning. Others propose that his name is actually closer etymologically to the name Ezra, a priest and scribe in the Hebrew Bible, and may derive from the Greek form of that name, Esdras. Others have suggested potential connections to Elijah. Whatever the case though, it's clear that Idris's name linguistically does not have a clear origin, nor is it obviously connected to Enoch, which is curious to say the least. So after looking at the Quran and the etymology of his name, what do we really know about Idris? Not much. He was a prophet, he had a reputation for being truthful and steadfast, but notably he was also, quote, raised to a high position. That phrase may be one of the key details that Muslim scholars and later interpreters try to make sense of, which brings us finally to Enoch. Like Idris, Enoch only shows up a few times in the Bible, where he's one of the key patriarchs before the flood, the father of Methuselah and the great-great-grandson of Adam. The verses where he shows up are famously mysterious. In Genesis, we're told only a few details. He fathered Methuselah at the age of 65, he walked with God for another 300 years, had other kids, and then at the age of 365, he was no more, because God took him. In the Second Temple period, Jewish writers massively expanded on his character in a series of apocryphal works generally called Enochic literature. The so-called First Book of Enoch is the oldest and probably the most famous of these. It's a compendium of texts that includes visions of heaven, stories about fallen angels called the Watchers, and elaborate prophecies about judgment. The somewhat later Second Book of Enoch also describes his ascent through multiple heavens where he's transformed into a glorious angelic figure. The Third Book of Enoch goes even further, identifying Enoch with the archangel Metatron, the supreme angel, a lesser god seated beside God's throne as his celestial attendant. I have published videos on all 3 of these if you're interested. Early Christians also saw Enoch as a model of faith and a witness to God's power over life and death. In the New Testament book of Hebrews, Enoch's brief mention in Genesis is expanded into a testimony of faith. By faith, Enoch was taken so that he did not experience death. For it was attested before he was taken away that he had pleased God. Another text, the Epistle of Jude, explicitly quotes from 1 Enoch, presenting Enoch as a prophet who foresaw the coming judgment upon the ungodly. These references show that at least some early Christians treated Enoch as an authoritative prophet whose heavenly ascent and revelations could be used to support Christian teachings. So when did Muslims start linking Enoch with Idris? Historians are not entirely sure, but it probably happened within the 1st century of Islam. Early compilers of hadith literature floated the idea, including Wahib ibn Munabbih, who died around 730 CE. He considered Idris and Enoch to be the same figure. He writes, "And Enoch's name in the Torah is Hebrew, and its translation in Arabic is Idris. And he is Idris, peace be upon him." He goes on to say that Idris had received 30 books of revelation, though some say this means 30 pages of the Quran. Regardless, the idea here is that Idris received special knowledge straight from God, and that he was aware of the truth of revelation early on, centuries before Muhammad. Again, Enoch's ascent to heaven is the defining feature of his story. He's taken up into heaven and never experiences death. Looking back to Surah 19, which states God raised Idris to a high position, the common understanding of that verse suggests that Idris was brought to heaven by God to serve some sort of celestial purpose. The assumption that he was raised into heaven like Enoch may be why so many Muslim commentators saw the two as one and the same figure. In one hadith, the Prophet Muhammad sees Idris in the 4th heaven during a part of the night journey called the Miraj, a series of visions Muhammad experienced during his own temporary ascent to the heavens. The text says, "When I was brought up, I saw Idris in the 4th heaven." And so, just like Enoch, God pulled Idris up from earth and gave him a place in heaven. In Islamic cosmology, there are 7 layers to heaven, each with their own special qualities. This 4th heaven, called Ma'una, is made of brass or white gold, and it's sometimes understood to be the eternal home of Idris alongside the Angel of Tears, a being identified in Jewish and Muslim traditions as Cassiel. So from this we can see that God affords a special place in the cosmos for Idris, just like Enoch in ancient Jewish and Christian thought. Okay, so far we've seen how Muslims connected Enoch with Idris, emphasizing their shared ascent into heaven and their roles as bearers of divine wisdom. But the story does not end there. Some scholars went a step further and linked Idris to yet another legendary sage, Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes Trismegistus is the legendary sage behind Hermeticism, a philosophical and religious tradition based around the text attributed to him. Historians generally understood him to be a syncretic combination of the Egyptian god Thoth and his Greek equivalent Hermes, both of whom are linked with the transmission of knowledge. By the late 1st century, though, Hermes Trismegistus was recognized as the quintessential philosopher, magician, and divine sage of the far distant past. Hermetic texts claim to be composed by him, and they span a gigantic range of topics: the nature of the universe and God, alchemy, astrology, magic, medicine, and a whole lot more. The most famous of these texts are found in the Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of 17 Greek texts composed sometime between 100 and 300 CE. They were later compiled into one corpus, though the roots of Hermeticism likely go back even further to the Ptolemaic period in Egypt. In fact, the Greek historian Herodotus identified Thoth with the Greek Hermes as far back as the 5th century BCE. I've published a whole intro to Hermeticism here if you're interested. In European literary traditions, Hermes Trismegistus became a towering symbol of occult wisdom, standing at the heart of Renaissance esotericism. He's credited with secret knowledge of astrology, alchemy, and magic, and Renaissance thinkers treated him as an ancient sage whose writings preserved a primordial philosophy older than Plato or even Moses. And in the Muslim world, he would also go on to represent a variety of esoteric or occult interests. But Muslim authors conceived of him differently. Take his epithet, for example, Trismegistus, which they interpreted differently than their European counterparts. In Greek, Trismegistus quite literally means the thrice great, which likely signals that Hermes had wisdom on an almost unimaginable scale. It may actually derive from an epithet of Thoth found in the Temple of Esna, south of Thebes, which calls Thoth the Great, the Great, the Great. Though in Arabic, the epithet is often rendered as Hermes' triplicate in wisdom. Muslim thinkers interpreted this as describing not one, but 3 separate figures, all named Hermes and each with their own life story and qualities. Together they formed a unified tradition of wisdom stretching across history. One Hermes was an Egyptian who lived before the flood, another was a Babylonian who lived right after the flood, and the final Hermes was also an Egyptian who lived long after the flood. Scholars aren't really sure where this idea of 3 different Hermeses came from. The tradition is messy and explanations vary. In 1954, the scholar Martin Plessner suggested that part of the story can be traced to the early 9th century Byzantine chronicle of George Synkelus, which quoted a book known as the Book of Sothis. This text mentions two guys, both named Hermes, one right before the flood and one right after. In this version, the first Hermes inscribed hidden knowledge in the Egyptian language on stone pillars so they could survive forever. But when the Great Flood came, the writings were buried and lost, only to be rediscovered by the second Hermes who restored ancient wisdom to humanity. It seems that stories like this filtered into Arabic literature through Greek sources that were circulating in the Middle East during the first centuries of Islamic rule. Where the idea of a third Hermes came from, however, we just don't know, but regardless, the first Hermes is consistently identified as none other than Enoch Idris. In his book, The Arabic Hermes, the scholar Kevin von Blottel shares how many Muslim writers connected these three figures. While the notion that Idris and Enoch are the same figure goes back to the 1st century of Islam, this connection with Hermes came a bit later. During the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates, various Greek philosophical subjects started to enter Arabic literary circles, which included Hermetic writings. The first text to clearly link Idris with Hermes is the Kitab al-Uluf, or the Book of the Thousands, which was composed by the Jewish astrologer Abu Mashar al-Balkhi. He was viewed as an authoritative figure on all things Hermes. Now, his Book of the Thousands does not survive as a single text, but it does pop up here and there in other authors' quotations. One quotation says that there were 3 Hermes. The first of them is Hermes who was before the flood. The significance of Hermes is a title, like saying Caesar. The Persians state that his grandfather was Gayumart, that is Adam. The Hebrews state that he is Enoch, which in Arabic is Idris. Even if it's only a fragment of the full book, this snippet gives us a lot of information. Here, Abu Mashar says that Hermes is a title for more than one person, like Caesar, the title for Roman rulers. Thus, it makes sense that there can be 3 different Hermes across time and space that are still connected because of their innate bond with esoteric knowledge. Later Muslim writers offered similar interpretations, like this 13th century Arab chronicler, who wrote Hermes is Enoch and he is Idris. Hermes is Syriac and means the scholar, as Hermes Trismegistus means the scholar of scholars. The word Hermes is not a name, but an attribute of knowledge. Idris is also not a name. He was called Idris because of his great scientific studies. His real name is Enoch. This account takes a similar angle as Abu Mashar, who said that Hermes was a title and not a name, but here he goes a step further and says Idris is also just a title. The Book of the Thousand also shows how people imagined the first Hermes as a righteous figure and a descendant of Adam, though here Adam is identified with Gayumart, a sort of Adam-equivalent first man figure in pre-Islamic Persian religions. So Abu Mashar presents the first Hermes as a figure who blends Hebrew, Persian, Arabic, and Greek traditions into a single identity. In this portrayal, Hermes emerges as a primordial being, one of the very first to walk the earth. And so we get a hint here as to how the perception of Hermes as Enoch and Idris works. Abu Mashar tells us that each community simply names the figure differently depending on their cultural context. Enoch equals Idris equals the first Hermes. The 10th century scholar Ibn Juljul says that the first Hermes was the first to study celestial events and the stars, making him the first known astrologer. He was also the first to build temples to God, the first to study medicine, and the first poet. We're also told that he was the first to foresee the coming of the flood and left warnings about it. This Hermes also lived in Upper Egypt, and he's credited as the true builder of the pyramids. Ibn Juljul writes, "It is reported by the account transmitted from the early Muslims that Idris was the first to study books, to investigate the sciences. God sent 30 scrolls down to him. He was the first to sew clothing and to wear it. God raised him to a high place." In short, since Idris was cast as the very first scientist and philosopher, people concluded he must be the same as Enoch and Hermes Trismegistus. In many ways, this mirrors the trajectory of Enoch in Judaism and Christianity, an obscure biblical figure whose role expanded dramatically in later writings. Though the Quran mentions Idris only briefly, later traditions multiplied his identity. First, a prophet like Enoch, then a primordial philosopher like Hermes, he became a figure who bridged scripture, philosophy, and esotericism. Hey everyone, a few months ago we offered an Intro to Coptic class where you can learn the final phase of the ancient Egyptian language using the Gospel of Thomas as your textbook. The response was amazing and a lot of you asked if we'd run it again. So we're bringing it back, and this time we're offering a Level 2 seminar if you want to go deeper. Dr. Lydia Bramer-McCollum is once again teaching the course. Lydia is an incredible Harvard-trained scholar of early Christianity and an absolute master of the Coptic language. Level 1 is our beginner-friendly course. You'll start with learning the Coptic alphabet, pronunciation, and grammar, and by the end you'll actually be reading and translating passages from the Gospel of Thomas. Level 2 picks up right after that, and it's for students who want to strengthen their reading skills. You can sign up over at our online learning platform, religiondepartment.com/Coptic. Lydia explains the course way better than I ever could, so I'll let her tell you about it herself. And right off the bat, students will be learning a new alphabet, right?
Yes, Coptic uses the Greek alphabet rather than hieroglyphs to write the Egyptian language, or this phase of the Egyptian language, and adds a few extra letters or characters. Why it does this is because Greek does not contain all of the sounds that Egyptian language uses. So those extra letters allow for those extra sounds to be expressed in Coptic as they were in earlier stages of the language.
So what's the first Coptic word that your students can expect to learn?
I introduced the alphabet in this course with a set of Coptic animals that both appear and those that don't appear in the Gospel of Thomas. So you will leave with skills beyond just reading the Gospel of Thomas. One that I pull out that is definitely the first word that students learn is the word for lion, or mui. So I use this as the first noun for example sentences, basic learning of the articles, or how to say the lion versus a lion, p mui or u mui in Coptic. And quite quickly, again in week 1, students will already be practicing the Coptic alphabet by reading all of the names that appear in the different sayings of Gospels. So becoming familiar with what Mariam and Jesus and Thomas look like in Coptic alphabet. Members of the religion department get 50% off all of our seminars. So if you join as a member, you can take level 1 for just $199 total. That's $99 for the annual membership and $100 for the Coptic seminar. And if you already know you want to continue on to level 2, we're offering a special discounted bundle for both courses for $275. So if you've ever wanted to learn the final phase of the ancient Egyptian language and actually read the Gospel of Thomas in Coptic, head on over to religiondepartment.com/Coptic. Thanks, everyone.